I could no longer hold my head up. My neck muscles were gone. My head had fallen forward and was resting on my chest. I could only see the front tire and the dirt road.
3, 2, 1.
Leadville, the podcast for the 100-mile mountain bike race, the show that breaks down, builds up, gets you ready, and freaks you out for the highest, hardest, one-day mountain bike race in the country. Hottie and Fatty here with a bonus episode with the two-time Leadville 100 women's single-speed champion and record holder, Lisa the Hammer Nelson, a.k.a. Fatty's wife.
Of course, we have Rebecca Rush in each episode of this show, but I wanted to bring in another woman's voice because there are a lot of women doing this race, and they aren't all pro cyclists. So I asked Lisa to tell not one of her recent stories of victory. I wanted to hear her story from her first racing of the Leadville 100. It is a story that starts with a broken nose, broken windshield, and broken teeth. An early mechanical that puts her literally in last place in the race, followed by driving rain, hypothermia, and a lot more. It is a story that is, frankly, an unbelievable plot for a disaster movie.
Yeah, but it's also a true story of tenacity.
Yeah.
But before we get to that story, this episode is presented by The Feed. One of the most important parts of having a great Leadville 100 is training the way you plan to race. And that's definitely true with your nutrition. TheFeed.com is a great way to get and train with whatever you're going to eat on race day. The Feed has an incredible variety, great recommendations, and training advice from their staff, fast shipping, and great pricing.
Check them out at thefeed.com/Leadville and use the code Leadville15 for a 15% discount on the Leadville training packs and racing packs. They are what I will use to race this year. And now, Lisa's story of her first Leadville 100, along with a few minutes of post-story Q&A.
Sometimes the times in our life that we suffer the most, we end up growing the most too. The most suffering I have ever done on a bike occurred back in 2000. During that suffering, I dug deep into my soul and found out what Lisa is really made of. In fact, I would say that was a turning point, a defining point in my life. And it occurred on my bike. I guess maybe that is why I've come to love my bike so much. It truly helped me figure out who I am and how strong I can be. It was the first part of August 2000. My brother Scott and I had been training all summer long for the Leadville 100 mountain bike race. 9 months earlier, my neighbor, Eldon Nelson, had persuaded me, and I, in turn, persuaded my brother that we should attempt the Leadville 100 mountain bike race. Eldon explained how challenging and how fun it was. His stories hooked me, and I signed up. My brother and I rode every chance we got. We only had mountain bikes, so we rode our mountain bikes everywhere, on the road and on the trails. We rode Eldon's Gauntlet, 80 miles and 8,000 feet on our mountain bikes. It is tough, enough on my road bike. I don't know how I did it on a mountain bike. Let's just say you move a lot slower on a mountain bike. It took about 3 hours longer on my mountain bike, turning a 6-hour road ride into a 9-hour mountain bike ride. During these training rides, my brother and I found that we were quite comparable in biking abilities and enjoyed riding together. Our relationship grew as well. My brother truly became my best friend. Up until that time, the time that I had left for Leadville, I could have chosen any number of my training rides and said that they were the most suffering I'd ever done on a bike. Every training ride seemed to push me past my perceived limit of what I thought I could ride. As we packed the truck with our bikes and gear that August morning, we were ready. We had put in the mileage and we thought we were ready for the challenge. As we were driving up Spanish Fork Canyon, voted one of the most deadly stretches of road in the United States, on our way to Leadville, we were all happily chatting about the upcoming race. My husband was driving the truck, I was sitting in the passenger seat, and Scott was sitting directly behind me. In one brief moment, I looked up and out the front window and I saw something flying towards us. My mind didn't comprehend what was coming towards me. I just knew it was coming, and it was coming fast. I braced myself for impact. And then the windshield exploded, but nothing ever hit me. I was screaming and I was confused. My husband was yelling something about them not knowing that they even hit us. I turned to my brother in the back seat and frantically asked if he had been hit. By what? I didn't know. His head was rolling around on his neck. His glasses were knocked off, and his mouth was bleeding. As my husband was pulling over, I found what had hit Scott. A piece of metal, 3 inches thick, 18 inches long, and 4 inches wide had come flying through the windshield and it hit Scott in the face. Thank heavens the piece of metal hit the hood before it came through the windshield, knocking off its missile-like track, or it would have decapitated my brother. Instead, it struck Scott in the face, breaking his nose and knocking his front teeth loose, as well as cutting up his face. A semi-truck that was passing must have kicked up the piece of scrap metal and sent it flying through the windshield. After an ambulance ride, an ER visit, a bunch of stitches in his mouth and face, a visit to the ENT who said Scott's nose was broken but not displaced, and a visit to our dentist, we made our way back home. Bruised and broken, Scott was still determined to do the race. Our dentist got to work making Scott a brace to keep his loose teeth in place, and the next day we were on our way to Leadville again. His mouth and nose were so swollen he could hardly breathe, but he didn't complain. He was there to race and tackle the beast known as the Leadville 100. Maybe someone was trying to tell us something. Maybe we shouldn't go to Leadville and race. Maybe we should wait and try again another year. Well, whoever was talking, we weren't listening. After a rainy week, Saturday morning dawned with a few clouds overhead. Scott and I lined up together. He still wasn't complaining and said he was able to even breathe a little through his nose. Thank heavens he didn't feel like he looked. He looked like he'd been through a meat grinder and his nose was huge. We started the St. Kevin's climb together, but we quickly lost each other. We had decided that this was an individual race. If we were able to ride with each other, great, but if not, we would tackle it solo. As we left the dirt and started to descend on the paved road, Scott went sailing by me, yelling words of encouragement, and then, not 2 minutes later, my back tire started making a funny noise, and my bike started to shimmy. I slowed down and, to my horror, saw I had a flat back tire. I pulled over, pulled out a tube, and proceeded to change my tire. Now, I need to stop telling the story to interject something here. Men, don't rescue your wives and your girlfriends every time they need help. For example, if they have a flat tire while riding their bike, let them change it. Don't help. Don't step in halfway through because they're going too slow and finish it for them. Let them change it all by themselves from start to finish. Needless to say, I had never changed a tire by myself prior to this. Granted, I knew the concept, I knew what I should do and how to do it, just never had actually done it myself. So, 45 minutes later, after everyone in the whole bike race had passed me, and I'm not exaggerating either, I put my back tire back on and started down the hill, only to find that the tire wasn't spinning right, and it was making this really bad thumping sound. I was frustrated and so very angry at myself, all for being so dumb. As I turned off the pavement and started up the single track, there was a man there directing traffic. I showed him my wheel, and he laughed. He explained to me that I didn't have the wheel seated correctly, and he put the wheel on right, and I was off. As I started up the single track, I passed a very old man pushing his bike. Yippee! I was no longer the last person in the race. As I rode, I continued to put myself down, telling myself how stupid I was that I didn't know how to change a tire, how stupid I was to be the last person in this race. I eventually rolled into the first aid station. I was lucky they were not pulling people off the course yet for being too slow. I eventually made it to Twin Lakes. My husband was there, wondering what in the world had happened to me. He said Scott had stuck around the aid station for about 30 minutes waiting. He was worried about me, with his broken nose and his face, but Scott had left about 10 minutes earlier. I might just be able to catch him. Thus far, I would say I had suffered more mental anguish than physical pain. How could I be so dumb? My success in the Leadville 100 was about to be ruined by my inability to change a tire, not my physical prowess. And then, as I rolled up Columbine, my spirits started to lift. I started seeing people and passing them. The adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and I was feeling invincible. The death march to the top was pretty torturous, but I was no longer alone. I was surrounded by other riders now. I rolled into the 50-mile aid station and turnaround point in exactly 6 hours and, to my amazement and surprise, caught up with Scott. I was ecstatic. Maybe, just maybe, I was going to finish this thing in less than 12 hours. Scott and I descended Columbine together, and we rolled into Twin Lakes aid station. We grabbed our windbreakers, I didn't have a raincoat, and we headed out. And that is when the story turns ugly. Not 5 minutes later, the heavens opened up and the rain began to pour. The next 20 miles had become a blur of rain and cold. As we started up the dreaded power line climb, I pulled ahead of Scott and thought I had lost him for good. As we pushed our bikes up the power line climb, the lightning was flashing overhead and the power lines were humming loud. The words of warning about lightning from the pre-race meeting were ringing in my ears, but I thought, to heck with them. I might just make this 12-hour mark. A little bit of lightning isn't going to stop me. There was a steady flow of walkers ascending power line who must have shared the same sentiment as me. While I was climbing, I guess I didn't realize how cold I was, but the realization of the cold hit me as I began the descent down the other side. I couldn't even shift. My fingers were so cold. I had to use the palm of my hand. Braking was non-existent. The grime from the muddy dirt had worn my brake pads down, and my cables had all stretched out. If I couldn't change a tire on my bike, I certainly knew nothing about tightening brake cables. As I came out of the single-track section and onto the paved climb, I had to have my volunteer actually tie my shoe. My hands were so frozen, I couldn't do it myself. That same volunteer asked if I wanted a garbage bag to wear, and in my frozen brain dead state, I declined. I thought I already had a jacket on. I also declined food. I was entering the worst bonk of my entire life. Up until this point in the race, I think I consumed about 10 power gels, not even close to enough nourishment for a 12-hour endurance ride in the freezing rain. I do not know how I had the strength to make it up the paved road, but somehow I summited, and I thought I had made it, and it was all downhill to the finish line. I knew it would be close to the 12-hour mark, but I was very hopeful. But I was wrong. It wasn't all downhill. Someone kept throwing in these damn uphill sections. Finally, I descended to St. Kevin's, and my bike computer said 98 miles. I was almost there. But where was the uphill boulevard that everyone talks about? I was so cold, my brain seemed to have stopped working. Now my bike computer said 100 miles, but I saw no finish line. I just kept pedaling into the rain. I could no longer hold my head up. My neck muscles were gone. My head had fallen forward and was resting on my chest. I could only see the front tire and the dirt road. I had been out in the pouring rain for more than 4 hours, but I just kept pedaling. Finally, the dirt road turned to pavement. I was getting closer. I had to use all of my might to throw my head up and look forward. Eventually, I saw the finish line. What was the time? I really didn't know or care. I just wanted the misery to end. As I crossed the finish line, my head was hanging. I really couldn't lift it up. I stopped the bike and I just stood there. Everyone was telling me to get off and get to the medical tent. But I couldn't. I couldn't get off my bike. I had no strength to even lift my leg over the bike. Someone finally laid the bike down, and I stepped over it. They got me to the medical tent. They stripped off my wet clothes and put me in a sleeping bag. I was on the verge of passing out. If I closed my eyes, I thought I would pass out. Everything was swimming, and I was so dizzy. As a nurse, I would have loved to know what my body temperature was. I finally started shivering. Up until that point, I hadn't even shivered. I think I was shutting down, but when the shivers started, they were violent. After more than an hour of sitting in an ambulance with the heat blazing, I finally started to warm up. So had it all been worth it? Did I make the 12-hour mark? And what had happened to Scott? Did he finish? Was he as cold as me? Yes, I finished in 11 hours, 55 minutes, and 30 seconds. I wasn't even the last ass over the pass. There were 7 people who finished behind me, and one of them was Scott. In fact, he finished 5 seconds behind me. I didn't know he was behind me, and he didn't know I was ahead of him. He was cold, but not as cold as me. More importantly, he had taken the time to eat. I think if I had taken in a few more gels, my body would have reacted better to the cold. I definitely learned a few lessons from my most miserable day on the bike, about racing and about life that day. I learned a few important things about nutrition and clothing choice when racing at high altitudes. More importantly, though, I learned that when faced with a challenge, I can push myself harder and farther than I thought I could. And also, when you're faced with a challenge, sometimes it's better to stop and take a breather, reassess the situation, utilize the help around you, and then continue on. I learned I can push through just about any physical challenge thrown at me while on a bike, but I need to learn to accept the aid along the way. In the years that followed my first Leadville 100, I faced many, many hardships. Many wondered how I kept myself together. I think it was because I learned who I was and what I can handle on a rainy mountainside in Leadville, Colorado.
So that was really good, hon.
Thanks, honey.
We should have a little bit of applause for you.
Thank you.
We need to bring more people in, or applause sound effects. But you get just me right now.
Well, that's good enough.
And this was your first Leadville, of course, and you did this way back in 2000, I think, right? Mm-hmm. And since then, you have raced it how many more times?
I think we decided this will be number 14, so I guess I've done it 13 times.
That includes 2 times that you finished under 9 hours.
Yep.
And you are the reigning single-speed champion of the Leadville 100. Even with all of that, though, I would say that this is one of my all-time favorite Leadville stories because you overcame a tremendous amount. So you were truly at the very back of the race. There was not a single person who was behind you.
Well, I think I said that 7 people finished behind me. So, which, I mean, I don't know if it was half the field actually finished the race that day. I'm not sure, but there was just a few people behind me that actually made the 12-hour
The 12-hour cutoff,
yeah.
Right. But, I mean, at some point during the race, after you had been working on your tire forever, you were literally the last person on the course.
And that was so demoralizing. I remember as I sat there and I really didn't know what I was doing with my bike tire. One by one, I mean, the race just passed, and pretty soon, it got less and less people, and then 1 or 2 people would go whizzing by me, and then pretty soon I was completely alone on that paved descent, and I was just so angry with myself. I didn't know what I was doing with this tire and tube and pumping it up, and oh my gosh, and then it was a back tire, and how do we get it back on the bike? It was super scary.
For sure. I think there's some encouragement there, though, for whoever is listening to this. Every year, there's someone who is at the very back of the race.
That's true. And you forget about that. But there is someone who is suffering back there.
Just because you are at the back of the race does not mean that your race is over.
That's true.
You are proof of that. Let's talk a little bit about your training. You and Scott rode everywhere. I have it on good authority that you had some like Rocky Balboa style training techniques where you would go riding with a backpack full of nurses' manuals. I mean, just like figuring that the if riding with your own weight is good, that riding with 30 pounds on your back is better.
My back might be a little bit better. I think that's my son's favorite story to tell. So, I honestly, I'm not sure how accurate that is, but if he thinks I'm that super strong, then we're going to go with it.
Let's say that it's true. I honestly don't have any difficulty imagining you saying, okay, how do I make this even more badass than it already is?
Need to bring the kitchen sink with me and the backpack.
That's right. It sounds like you had during this almost exactly 12-hour race that you consumed maybe 1,000 calories?
If that. I mean, honestly, I don't even think food was something I consciously thought about. I thought, if I consume a few gels here and there, I'll be fine. I mean, prior to this race, I'd run a couple of half marathons, and with half marathons, 1 gel was adequate. So I think I thought, if I eat 1 an hour, I should be fine. I just, food didn't seem to be really important to me. I don't remember stressing about eating. I hated gels at that time. I mean, it was literally gagging them down. They've come a long way. I actually enjoy them now, but back then it was misery to take them. So
what would you tell other women who are considering or are training for this race for the first time.
It is an amazing, life-changing event. I mean, there's highs and lows on that course. In your training, you're not going to really hit. But out there on the course, I mean, you learn something about yourself. And more importantly, hats off to you. Continue to train. I mean, it's an amazing experience.
What would you tell your fellow women racers or any other racers in terms of getting your bike ready or knowing what you need to know about the bike itself?
Well, be familiar with learning how to change a tire, that's for sure. And do that in your training. Put that on your list of need to know things. Yeah, and then the weather. I mean, it's pack a jacket, stick it in your camelback or in your back pocket or something, and you may be needing to use it. And if you don't, then that's a great. It was something small that you brought along with you.
Better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it.
Exactly.
So, last question. One thing you said toward the end of your story is that this race really did change your life, and I'm wondering how.
Yeah, as I think back, I think I was, I don't know, probably in my early 30s when I did this race. Up until that time, I'd had 3 children, gone to school, but basically just been a mom. I hadn't really found myself. I mean, my identity was being a mom. And, in the few years prior to this, I had started running, dabbled with the mountain bike, but I'd never pushed myself at all. I didn't know my limits. I wasn't an athlete in high school or anything. Didn't know what my body could do. So, when Eldon tossed this challenge out, and it was 100 miles on a mountain bike, I'd done the White Rim Trail in a couple of days, which is 100-mile, but it took me a couple of days. I'm like, what can I do? What potential do I have? So even in the training, as I went out on my rides with my brother, and I was like, I was doing stuff that I never dreamt of doing. I mean, going up and over what we call the Alpine Loop. Mm-hmm. I mean, something that, I'd see other people do, not me, and here I was doing it. I mean, I did it. And then I added on additional, climbs onto that same Alpine Loop. I mean, I was doing things that just were beyond my comprehension, So going into the race, I was confident, okay, I think I can do this 100-mile thing, but then you throw in the rain and you throw in the mechanical, stuff that I hadn't really even contemplated before. And I was throwing these obstacles in. I overcame. I changed the tire. I got back on my bike, Mm-hmm. The rain started to pour and I still pedaled on. It kept throwing these things at me, and I was determined I was going to beat that dang 12-hour clock. The lightning was buzzing overhead, and I'm hearing.
I remember.
I'm hearing, the lightning, the power lines are humming, and you can smell the electricity in the air. And I'm thinking, I should be stopping, but I'm like, no, can I do this? Can I get to the finish line? And I did, and it almost dang near killed me. I mean, I don't know where my body temperature was. I honestly think I was on the verge of hypothermia. I mean, it was really quite scary, And so the next day dawns, and here I have done this amazing feat, way more than I'd ever thought in my life I could actually overcome these challenges that were thrown at me. And then, and I learned something about myself. So literally, I the next several years of my life, I was thrown challenges one after another in my life. And I honestly, the things that I learned mentally through that race just carried me on. I'm like, you know what? If I can do this, I can do anything. If I can overcome what I did on that damn mountainside in Leadville, Colorado, I can do anything.
It changes your yardstick of what you're capable of doing. Yeah. No question about it. wouldn't wish rain and hypothermia in the midst of an incredible bonk and on anyone. But if you survive it, then that's something.
You're that much stronger.
Thanks for telling your story, hon.
You're welcome.
Hottie, it's kind of weird to have a couple of cameos in a story like this, because back then, of course, I was just the bike-obsessed neighbor. Although I am proud to say that at the finish line after Lisa finished this race, it was me who had the bright idea to lay that bike down so Lisa could step over it and get over to the ambulance. I have never, ever seen a person so absolutely, completely demolished after a race. But I also have never seen anyone who is so absolutely, ferociously determined. At the time, I didn't realize that's kind of Lisa's signature move.
She really did make every single possible rookie mistake you can make.
Yep.
And then there was the bad luck, the flat tire, the rain. But she still finished. Lisa really proves that a huge chunk of finishing the Leadville Trail 100 is just not giving up.
Yeah, and I believe that is it for this bonus episode. If you haven't yet subscribed, please head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, sign up, and be sure to leave us a nice 5-star rating and a review.
This is still a young podcast, so you doing so makes an enormous difference in whether other Leadville 100 racers and hopefuls can find us.
We'll be back in your feed very soon. Till then, train well, race hard, and we'll see you at the finish line red carpet.